However you are and whenever you are, welcome back to Coffee and UFOs. This is Alan B. Smith, your most grateful host. I have a and I know I say that at times, but this time it truly is a very special guest, because our guest tonight, Peter Robbins, is a legend in my mind in the field of ufology. He is someone that I care for, I consider a friend, and who has been very supportive of my podcasting over the years, and that is none other than Peter Robbins. He will be covering not only decades worth of his experience tonight with us, but we'll be drawing the bridge between 30, 40 years ago, when he was looking into the UFO, now UAP subject, and what it looks like now. What's the same? What's changed? His show also happens to be on the UNX network, just like this here Coffee and UFOs podcast. And it is Meanwhile Here on Earth, where Peter Robbins really does a great job of kind of flipping the script on investigators and journalists of the UAP and UFO enigma. And instead of just talking about UFOs and aliens, he does an amazing biographical, journalistic interviewing style. And it really brings a lot of depth to the many people that you and I are familiar with in these fields. So I highly recommend going out and checking Meanwhile Here on Earth, Peter Robbins' own podcast. This podcast, Coffee and UFOs, can be found on the UNX network. It will be streaming live, rebroadcast, live stream on the UNX network, 2 a.m. Eastern on Friday evenings and 11 p.m. Pacific time Thursday night, in case you missed the live stream here. And of course, this podcast will be posted every Friday, wherever you listen to your podcast. And if you're a fan of Coffee and UFOs, if you appreciate this subject and the guests that we have on, please go to wherever you listen to those podcasts, leave a review, some comments. All that is really helping to continue the growth of Coffee and UFO. Speaking of, as I kind of stutter along here, I'm going to have a little bit more coffee. It's been a long day, but my gosh, it is worth it to bring on the one and only Peter Robbins. Peter, welcome back. How are you?
I'm okay. It's good to be back with you, Alan, on this cold, snowy night up here in New York State.
I still have frozen lips from earlier today. So, you are meaningful to me in many ways. And I just want to remind people here. So before Coffee and UFOs, I had a podcast called Paranormal Now, which was on the old Inception Radio network.
Yeah.
And you were one of my earlier guests. And I was honored that you had broken your story about your co-author at the time on that podcast. And it spoke so loudly to your integrity as a human being and as a investigator. So I just want to thank you for that, because I think you set a really good example. It's hard. The sunk cost fallacy is a problem in this field. And you went out there and you showed people that you don't have to get stuck. You can do the right thing. And I think that's amazing. So before we continue with the conversation on UFOs, I do want to just update people and give a little background on how you got involved in the subject in the first place.
Highly unintentionally.
Isn't it for all of us?
Very much against my will and intentions on a certain level.
Mm-hmm.
More than 40 years ago, an aspiring artist living in Lower Manhattan, I had a dream that I was living, and one that had been encouraged in the adult world around me since I was a small boy. I was gifted as a painter and doing drawings and the like, and it was a natural career path. I studied art at university, then transferred to the School of Visual Arts in Manhattan, and pursued that career. And by the time I was really in my late 20s, things were just going the way I had hoped they would. I was starting to show my work at galleries. I was part of a world that I found absolutely fascinating. I was meeting well-known artists and um, part of a tradition, a life that is just goes back in time. And for a number of reasons that I think I understand now, I had the return of a childhood memory that I had repressed, of a profoundly unambiguous UFO sighting,
Yeah.
more specifically, 5 disc-shaped objects coming in over the neighborhood I came of age in on Long Island. And my sister and I watched them. They were close enough to make out what we could only read as windows. They were silvery white, and there they were. And to compress the story considerably, it was really too much for me at a certain point. My only interest up until that point, I was 14, but probably intellectually like 9, had a very happy childhood and a simpler time. I guess anybody that watches old time TV and may remember the character Leave It to Beaver,
Yeah.
that's about how sophisticated I was.
Gotcha.
But I really liked my life and had all kinds of interests. Again, UFOs didn't fit into them other than the wonderful black and white movies that I usually would see on Saturday mornings or afternoons at our local movie theater
Mhm.
of, monsters invading the earth and all the good stuff. But I think I intuited strongly the adult message unspoken that it might be that this was fantasy, yet there they were.
Mhm.
While watching them, Alan, I had a reaction that I've since chronicled, confirmed with many, many witnesses or experiencers, myself being a witness, um, that I call the checklist reaction. You're minding your own business, you're living your life, and all of a sudden, there it is, or there they are. And your logical mind just goes down the list of what this is not, or what they are not.
Mhm.
And I literally remember once the memory reemerged.
You remembered actually doing that in your head.
Well, again, the memory was submerged and hidden with one interesting breakthrough
Mhm.
from the time I was 14 until I was in my late 20s, something over 14 years.
Mhm.
And I knew that what I was looking at were not planes, helicopters, kites, blimps, dirigibles, strange shaped clouds, formations of birds, flotsam and jetsam, reflections from the ground. And at a certain point, realized I was looking at something wholly other. And that everything I thought I knew now was open to question. Um,
Sure.
I should also say that I not only had no exposure to the subject, but nobody who I knew had any interest in it. I didn't know there were such things as UFO conferences. I think I knew there were UFO magazines because you'd see them on the stands, kind of pulp magazines. But again, it was a subject I paid no attention to. 14 plus years past, that memory comes roaring back, and I'm down in my loft in East Chinatown, sitting on the floor thinking, I think I'm having some kind of mental episode, or I'm going crazy, um, or having some kind of breakdown because this can't be. I couldn't have forgotten something that was the most profoundly different, interesting, provocative thing I had ever seen.
Sure.
And yet we know the human mind can repress much more conventional memories if it needs to. I had a witness, and once I calmed down and thought things through, I phoned my sister, Helen, who is an aspiring poet living a mile or so north of me in the East Village. Asked her if it was a good time to talk, told her a memory had returned to me. I needed her confirmation, and that I didn't want to tell her what I remembered because I knew she'd say yes or no. And then I'd really not know for sure. So I set the scene, told her what the weather was like, about
Yeah.
how old we were, the time of year, where we were standing, cut me off mid-sentence, and repeated the memory. I was flabbergasted because it was conscious. She had never forgotten it.
Mhm.
I asked her why we never talked about it. And she reminded me that that afternoon she came up to me and asked me if I wanted to talk about it. And I said no. And the years started to pass.
Yeah.
And one would think that would be plenty. I think if it had just been that, Alan, I would have been one of those many people in the world who had a really serious interest in UFOs, but would hardly be talking to you from my current vantage point all these years later on this podcast. It's what she said next that totally changed my life, and for a good period of time, not really for the better, which was telling me about a series of fragmented memories, but conscious memories of being taken and being on board a craft and being examined.
Yeah.
This is years before the term gray existed and described the beings. And I had a BC AD moment in my life, basically, that you count back or forward from, thinking for a moment that my sister had gone crazy, and then with a little self-humor reminding me that I had just, talked about the 5 flying saucers hanging over the Parker's house close enough to see windows, and thought, listen to your sister.
Yeah.
Now, the things she said were so archetypical to me and would be to you, even word for word, of what she was remembering, the procedures, the voices in her head, what exactly they were saying. And over the next days, weeks, and months, I continued to paint and draw and take photographs and teach painting at my alma mater. But the passion to be one of those few people that really makes it as a serious professional artist in New York City took a mortal blow. I continued to work in the field for years, but the UFO books started to replace the art books. Within a year, I had made a new friend, another painter, who had just started to take a serious interest in the subject, named Bud Hopkins. The following year, we gave our very first UFO presentations together on the stage of the School of Visual Arts, where I taught. And our lives took off in different ways, in different trajectories.
Yeah.
But I was so disturbed by what I had come into. I was really frozen for some time. I knew my sister was sane. I felt I was. But any adult who took UFOs seriously, I really had to question. And so I was very careful in starting over the months to choose initial colleagues, mentors. And I also needed to put myself in therapy. Seriously, and I found a psychotherapist who took the subject seriously and who helped me to understand that I wasn't crazy, nor my sister. The world was. These things happen, and it might be an area that I should take part in. And over the years, I started doing what I do.
Did the psychotherapist work with anyone else who had experiences?
I don't know, but his distinction for me was when I was still a teenager, I was introduced to the writings of brilliant Austrian psychotherapist and social observer, Dr. Wilhelm Reich. And over those 10 years that I read Reich's work on and off, I was aware that in the 1950s, he had serious UFO sightings and really interacted with the phenomena via an extraordinary device that he created, repeatedly documented visually and by instrument by other scientists. But I hadn't given it much thought. And when this memory, the post-memory time, I remembered this, also remembered that his first assistant for the last 11 years of his life was still alive and practicing. He was well in his 70s at the time, but I found Dr. Ellsworth F. Baker, who had 2 UFO sightings of his own, one with Reich, and took the subject very seriously. So there was no need for me to have to justify or explain. There were other issues I was dealing with, as anyone in therapy does, but he really helped me to put it in place and realize they're real. This is important work. The implications for humanity are very significant, and I was hooked.
You were hooked, which means is that another way of saying you were a believer, or did you need more convincing?
I've always kept away from that word believer. I became interested in the subject having nothing to do with belief. There they were, as real as the chair that I'm sitting in. And so that whole aspect of the way the mind functions really has was short-circuited in a way. Also, when we talk about UFO, UAP studies, as you know, it's a very big tent covering many specialty areas of research. The pie slice I was first interested in was specifically the abduction of people by this one group of beings. And I keep coming back to that, although my interests have expanded and covered many other areas of research and investigation over the years.
And that's understandable because of your familial experience, I think. I think that you would be more sympathetic.
But belief, again, wasn't it. I knew there was something real. And the ones I was interested in was the ones that had interacted with my sister, who began to work with Bud Hopkins once he became Bud Hopkins, the investigator, so to say, and a wonderful friendship as well that they had. Once Bud's first book was published, that was Missing Time, which is the first real serious case history of experiencers observing patterns that are similar from one to the next, one of them being missing time. Not only was that the title of his book and a phenomena that happens to so many abductees, but he gave a new phrase to the English language, like gray, in the world of UFO studies for a brief while. They owned it, but because of popular culture, many folks who don't follow this subject know what a gray is. They also know that missing time has a specific non-standard, if you will, paranormal aspect to it. And once that book was published, I started to work with him informally for the years leading up to it. One painter to another, I sometimes would work in his studio as his studio assistant. And that would come back over the years, sometimes nostalgically, decades later. But it was a very interesting first meeting. And, as in life, you never know where something's going to lead. He had published his very first case study in 1976. I was about less than a year into the work. And it was published in a publication you're familiar with, The Village Voice, a New York staple, but not a UFO publication, a political publication. And
I found job postings there when I was younger too. Very, very useful. Yeah.
You can find this article, by the way. It's easy to trace down on the internet. The title of the article, and it's from 1976 in the Village Voice. Sane man sees UFO. I walked by a news kiosk. Sane man sees UFO.
Okay.
And I, of course, bought the paper, went home, read it in one sitting, thought it was the best thing I had read on the subject. Contemporaneously, I had started to read used books I was picking up, Donald Kehoe and M.K. Jessup, some of the early classics. But as far as a case study, he hit the ground running. It's brilliantly written up and backed up. And I just went to the New York City phone book. There was only one Bud Hopkins in it and 2 Ds. And I just cold called him and introduced myself and told him about my memory and my sister's experience. And the very first question he asked me, it's the very beginning of a 35-year friendship, was, tell me about your art. And that didn't go really well. And Bud was a late period abstract expressionist. I was coming out of the minimalist conceptualist tradition. but he
Okay.
was
Yep.
interested in what happened to Helen and invited me over for coffee. And a few days later, that's just what I did.
Did you
We sat.
continue debating art after that as well, or?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
art and New York City and popular culture and the theater
Mhm.
and films ran through our entire relationship. But you never know how things are going to go when you meet somebody new
Sure.
in your life.
Well, so what's the perspective when you were looking at the UFO phenomena then? Now, how do you contrast it to the way you look at it today?
Well, number one, it was for me a number of independent investigators that I was meeting, a handful of organizations. I think APRO was still around. NICAP, I think, had recently been deceased,
Mhm.
and MUFON was there. I think I joined for a year in the late 70s, and then every few years I joined again and then not join. But it was mostly for me, my perception was independent individuals, overwhelmingly middle-class white guys, middle-aged white guys, who were doing the work and wanting to be taken seriously, speaking at conferences, publishing in paper journals, writing books, and giving talks. This was decades before the internet. You'd subscribe to a publication, or you would write to somebody by mail and sometimes follow up with an actual meeting,
Yeah.
compare notes. Um, all of us, this is the Freedom of Information Act came in under President Carter. So this was before the Freedom of Information Act.
Mhm.
But there were authentic, important documents out there that had been naturally declassified, put in the National Archives, and there to find, for diligent researchers.
Mhm.
And we would copy and trade copies of authentic, declassified documents. It was quite a big deal for many of us to, it seems so simple now and so almost,
Yes, but
it was, we were kind of making it up as we were going along in a certain way. And
right. But if I
um,
may interject,
yeah,
I would like to add that experience actually kind of gives you a depth of insight, uh, in more wisdom, I think, in some ways, because when information like now it's coming at you rapid fire,
yeah,
back then, because I started reading about this, TV first in the 80s and then reading in the 90s,
yeah,
uh, you had time to sit on a book.
yeah.
You had time, and something would come out maybe on Coast to Coast, right? A news item of some sort that was, revelatory, and then you can think about it for a while. The alien autopsy, right? You can really talk about it and let it sink in. Now you've got a week, and then the next thing is happening. It's amazing.
Even more than that, now the world of UFO studies is peopled with very colorful personalities,
Mm.
many of them with incredibly professional sources of dissemination, the website, um,
Yeah.
demi organizations,
Hmm.
followers, many of them kind of at the celebrity level. Also, the world of television in the 70s really wasn't covering this at all. And it was just regular old fashioned television. Now, how many hundreds of television shows and documentaries and independent uh, films,
Hmm.
you can get lost in it. Um, it was it was so very different. Plus, we were, even among ourselves, we knew we were considered outsiders. And for many of us, we knew people that knew and cared about us, affectionately behind our back. That's my friend, Peter. He's into UFOs. And then somebody, oh, you're into UFOs. Do you believe in reincarnation? And
Yeah.
um, you just get kind of tagged as a bit of a goofball. And
It was all under the umbrella of paranormal,
yeah,
supernatural. Yeah.
In 1991, and again, by that point, I was considerably into the subject.
Hmm.
My sister and I, Helen, who went on from being a poet to a gold and platinum record
Rocker.
award-winning
Yeah.
singer-songwriter and performer in greater New York area, and beyond that, um, she um, was very upfront and very public about her experiences from the get-go. But 19, and we were not just brother sister, but very good friends. She passed in 2000, and we were roommates in a number of apartments and a house over the years. A great, great friend again, as well as sibling. And it was the pilot episode of a new weekly show on whatever network it was on called The X-Files.
Mm.
And we sat there enwrapped watching this show together. And of course, it was if you watch the pilot, it was as good as a pilot can be. We get, the basic characters, the thrust of the thing, the dynamics.
Yeah.
And we find that this eccentric FBI agent is obsessed with the subject because his sister was taken.
Yes.
And in the plot, of course, she wasn't returned. And I remember at the end of the show, we didn't say a word to each other the whole time. She just turned around and looked at me. She says, "That's you," with certain modifications. And I thought, that's what obsession is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I still wonder, I guess I have whatever answers I'm going to have relative to her specific experience, as well as anybody can.
Yeah.
And, you go on from there. But now it's an institution. It's a big business.
Right.
It's a lot of competing, very energetic, often very intelligent, sometimes somewhat devious personalities looking for airtime, uh, wanting to be better known. And I find it fascinating in kind of a dispassionate Mr. Spock, eyebrow raising way, that this entire, it's an industry. And right now it is wide open. One of the challenges is that, unlike, say, if you and I were a doctor or a lawyer and we acted unethically, or we put forward information to a patient that wasn't correct, whatever, we could lose our licenses. There's the AMA, the Bar Association. Within ufology and the greater study of the paranormal, I believe in order to be a ufologist, the qualifications are basically touch your finger to your nose, turn around 3 times and say you're one and get to work. There's no way
I think that's the ritual I did. Yeah.
We can criticize each other or in dialogue, or behind each other's backs, but there's no, it's the Wild West on a certain level.
Well, there is a checks and balance.
Well, yes, it depends on the individual. And an example would be if you are a member of MUFON, Mutual UFO Network, the largest UFO research organization in the world, but still only consisting of, X number of thousands of people, and you become an investigator and you pass that course, which is quite rigorous. And then
it was a big book.
Yeah, you blow it, you fake your information, whatever, they can kick you out. But
and they do background checks and everything.
But that's the exception to the rule. We're on our own, and most of us try to follow, I believe, some kind of moral compass, and one foot in front of the other, and do our best to bring our corner of the truth to the public realm.
Yeah, and the self-regulating that exists are by other researchers, documentarians. So Darcy Weir was on the podcast a couple of episodes back, and his documentary, put a lens right on David Wilcox and Corey Good story, and really just uncovered that entire thing, just to and expose the absolute sham and bamboozling that occurred. And the thing is, I think for a long time, people were afraid to call out charlatans, because if you did, then it's like another bruise on the image of ufology, so that I think the approach often was just ignore those guys, or just pay attention to this. But I think more and more we're seeing people come out, especially on social media, and just call people out, like, this is BS, this is whatever. Yeah. Oh, you're unmuted, Peter.
Did it again, pesky little Mike. As you know, things changed. In December of 2017, with the publication of several landmark articles in the New York Times by Leslie Kean, Ralph Blumenthal, and Helene Carter, that really changed the game. I remember at the time thinking, gee, it's great. We've got, 2 articles in an important newspaper that usually does not take the subject seriously. But it took me almost a year to realize that something profound had shifted, and that the other shoe wasn't going to fall. And we go back to wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and flying saucers and little green men. Yep. That now that the world of officialdom may be best embodied by the House of Representatives and their continuing efforts of certain members to push forward to relinquish some of the terrible secrecy that the subject is mired in, has changed the climate as well as the game. The same thing in the world of academia. This, for me, has been a tremendous breath of fresh air. There was a time not that long ago that if you were a professor or associate professor or even a high school teacher, and you took this seriously, and your students knew it, or you had the bad form to speak about it, it could be a problem in your career. Same thing for an established scientist or other professional. But now we're seeing more and more people with advanced degrees in teaching positions or in research positions like Avi Loeb at Harvard, who are not worried, as John Mack would have been 20 years before. Not that he was worried, but he was censured by Harvard, and it took taking his case to the board with his lawyer, Daniel Sheehan, to have him reinstated. We're in a much healthier climate now.
Much healthier. There's still a ways to go, because I do see backsliding on occasion. Yep. I still see the occasional snickering from a news reporter, or the little smile. It happens, but much less often. My concern, and this brings us to the subject of the drones. My concern is that with the drone activity, it once again gives mainstream media reporters and anchors something to excuse, yes, the UFOs. So what do you think? What's going on with the drone scenario?
I don't know, but I'll tell you some of the thoughts that I've had. One is, it just stopped. It just stopped cold when it stopped. All of a sudden, they weren't there anywhere, and we're not hearing about them anymore. I think initially, and this is educated speculation, it was a test of technology within more advanced military drones to pick up radioactive signatures. Again, it's one of a number of theories that's been put forward of the possibility of, a terrible scenario, but enough plutonium to make a dirty bomb, and that New York City would be a logical place to set it off. But let's do the test nearby and focus it in New Jersey. And then people with drones sending them up, small planes joining, other official but unassociated drones, then copycat operations in different parts of the country and then other countries, and all of it leading to a tremendous amount of confusion, anxiety, concern. I, like you, sometimes get calls or notes from old friends from earlier in your life, who look to you, as people who now take the subject more seriously, but don't have another person, to turn to as knowledgeable. And I was actually taken aback by how many old friends contacted me from different parts of the country, some going back to elementary school. What is going on? We saw them over the house. I am concerned. A friend in England who ultimately said after a sighting, she was frightened and didn't know what she was frightened about at a certain point. It was just too much hanging in the air. Also,
Yeah, yeah,
our timing right now, at this exact moment in time, with a major change on the political landscape in this country and by extension internationally.
yeah.
Right now, a tremendous amount of concern in this country for our friends and brothers and sisters in Southern California. And that kind of a reminder that, if there's some huge, horrible hurricane, cyclone, typhoon in Bangladesh that kills 100,000 people, it's a footnote in an American newspaper where we look
It's
very
closer to
much
home.
increasingly inward in this
Yeah,
country, more isolationist all the time, it seems. And of course, this is a terrible tragedy.
yeah,
And maybe also because the area involved is so iconic and so beautiful. And in terms of, part of the American heart and
yeah.
dream, Hollywood and the neighborhood surrounding it. As we were talking beforehand, before we went on the air, just in the past few hours, I've been in touch with two friends who have had evacuation orders sent to them just, this evening.
Yeah.
But it's kind of emblematic in a way of the moment that we seem to be in, spinning around us, for many of us seemingly out of control, and the future of this subject now as we kind of enter this new year.
Yeah.
And a very interesting year, I'm sure it's going to be, however one wants to interpret the word interesting, and what is going to be happening with this increasing push for more openness and
Yeah.
for less secrecy on this subject. Anybody's guess, I think.
Peter, it was interesting. I was, fortunate. Thank you for to being a guest on your panel
Oh yeah, that was
before the
fun.
holidays. Yes, yeah, and over Christmas break, my wife and I were driving on the Jersey coast, and we saw a drone, or I saw a drone, but I was driving, and I'm looking out the window, and it wasn't a parallax effect. It was close enough that I could identify this as a drone. And I was like, I was in awe, like, oh my God, I'm seeing one of these things, but I, couldn't stop the car and I couldn't whip out my phone and take it as I'm, going by. But it really does speak to your point that it was quite common for a few weeks here in like the New York, Jersey area.
Yeah.
And then, I have heard of a couple of, reports apparently, but nothing like what was going on there for a few weeks. I think that, and I brought this up on your show, it's interesting. We haven't had like a sighting type of a flap since the Stephenville, Texas,
Texas, yeah,
2008.
that's right.
Yeah. And I've been waiting for a long time. Like, when's the next big one coming? And is that what we experienced? I know that Stephen Bassett and other people have speculated that maybe these are actually UAP that, are disguising themselves.
I will jump in here and say another thing, a phenomena that we've been faced with now and looking at for some years in a acknowledged way is orbs. Are these intelligences themselves? Are they reconnaissance things? Are they, what are they? And that they seem to have entered into this as well. Also, whatever plan, whatever intention set this off, may have been following really an ancient way of dealing with the public in certain matters, which is when you want attention taken off of something that's happening, create
Hmm.
something of your own as a sideshow to
Sure.
take the attention.
Yeah, yeah.
And once again, we're faced with that as a possibility or one of a number that are woven in. But I wouldn't put it past uh, any of the great powers. We also know from declassified UFO related documents from the Soviet era
Hmm.
that they were as concerned as we were back
Right.
in the
Yeah.
day. And that
Hmm.
for 45 years, a UFO event might serve as cover for something, an incursion of an aircraft into enemy territory, or
Hmm.
vice versa. That, a story about an incursion might cover for a legitimate anomalous phenomena object where it shouldn't be.
And I think I can understand that and I think there is an argument to be made for psyops. For instance, Annie Jacobson's book Area 51,
Well,
she makes the argument. you're, if you're listening to the podcast, Peter just rolled his eyes. I am internally as well, because what she proposes is that it's really Russians sent a faux UFO as a psyops program to scare the U.S. military, to distract us, and that we would somehow be fooled by either deformed bodies of whatever in this craft. And there's so many evidentiary contradictions that
and yeah,
it's like this would not hold up in a court of law. There's no way in heck. And yet, people eat it up, because if you throw
yes,
enough information at the wall,
yeah.
people see all of this glitter, and then that's the story that they start to believe. And I think it was very effective.
Yeah, I think we're dealing with uh, a very identifiable phenomena there. I forget whether it's Professor Jacobson or Ms. Jacobson, but she had, the Harvard cachet,
Hmm.
and she wrote a book. I think Harvard University Press published it. The debunker's mantra, as I've made up in my mind, is it can't be, therefore it isn't, therefore it's something else.
Hmm.
And it's my self-assigned job to pat you on the head and give you some pseudoscience and explain it away. If just the basic fact is true, and I'll paraphrase the late great Stanton T. Friedman,
Hmm.
the question is not, are UFOs representative of advanced technology from parts unknown under intelligent control coming and going with impunity? The question is, has one ever been? And the answer to that is an overwhelming yes.
Yeah.
That, for those of us who, like me, went through that Alice's looking glass experience, accompanied by complete shock, and a threatening of everything that you thought you knew,
The deconstructing of your paradigm, your
it's much
worldview. Yeah.
more preferable to make
Hmm.
someone wrong,
Right.
even if they're correct or they're decent, because if it's true, then all those certificates on your wall
Hmm.
or your life experience is now open to question. And again, better, it's dirty pool, but better to call
Yeah.
somebody a liar or delusional
Yeah.
or well-meaning but mystical or a believer, or a dreamer on this kind of thing. And we
Hmm.
will keep seeing it. I think one phenomena that we should be aware of right now is after all these years, going back to 1947, it is now socially acceptable for two reasonably intelligent, sophisticated
Yeah.
adults or not to talk about this without a general feel of ridicule. However, an associated phenomena, which is the UFO abduction phenomena, is still verboten to a great degree.
Hmm.
As an old time researcher said to me, talking about the beginning of abduction related research back in the 70s, we were focused on the cars and not the drivers. You could talk about a radar return or
Yeah.
physiological evidence in a trace case that had been transformed when come into contact with UFO or the non-standard situation.
Yeah.
You could work on archival materials and interview witnesses, but to talk about the beings themselves, then you were crazy. And in fact, the first serious project I was ever involved in 1978 with my first mentor, retired Major Koman von Kavetsky, a member of the Hungarian Royal Army staff. He was in charge of all photo reconnaissance for the Hungarian army during World War II and photo education. That was my first mentor. He wrote an extraordinarily important paper that the Secretary General then, at the time, Kurt Waldheim, some years before we learned he had been an SS officer and didn't cop up to that originally, awkward moment. But it was a paper about how important it was for the Americans and the Soviets to come to some kind of mutual agreement and understanding that if an unknown were to come into their airspace and be interpreted as an enemy missile or bomber, that it could set off a nuclear conflagration when it was really a truly anomalous UFO. And it was a wonderful way to kind of enter the work. And I'm slightly off topic, but it's a question that's going to come up again. It's a very important question that's never really fully been dealt with.
Do you remember the name of the paper, the title?
Oh, yeah. It was a book. I can literally pull it off my shelf. I don't think it's available. I'd make it available to you. But hold it one moment. It's worth seeing.
Okay, so we're going to do real-time research, pulling from Peter's vast library. And I've, my wife and I have seen Peter's library, and it is quite the collection. So yeah, some really interesting. Thanks everyone from chat, by the way, for defining the wave and the flap. I appreciate that, guys. Okay, cool. Let me get that a bigger screen there. Okay. Yeah. World. I can't read the.
Yeah, it's Coleman was Hungarian and wrote English sometimes as though it were Hungarian, but World Authority for Spatial Affairs, just spatial affairs, so to say, with the Hungarian touch. And I got a credit in it, and it actually gave me an opportunity to take part in my very first UFO-related event several years before I went to my first UFO conference. I was in the gallery at the United Nations in a special meeting of the General Assembly, listening to Alan Hynek and Stanton Friedman and Jacques Vallée, and a statement from Gordon Cooper, astronaut. Present was an American lieutenant colonel who had been involved in a very recent and very well documented helicopter UFO event on the floor of the United Nations. It was quite an introduction to beyond my own research and experience.
Yeah, that's amazing. So early on in your research days as well. Yeah. Speaking of astronauts and UFOs, you made me think of Dr. Edgar Mitchell, who was very much into the psychic capabilities as well, not just extraterrestrials. And I don't know, have you heard of this podcast, Peter, called The Telepathy Tapes? Okay, I highly recommend it. It is a documentarian study, and it's an all podcast, but there is a website that highlights some of these tests that were performed. It covers certain people who have autism that are unable to speak or very limited in their ability to speak.
I have heard about it, and somebody sent me a link, but I haven't watched it yet.
It is, well, right now I think it's just the podcast. I'm sure they're going to make like a proper film, documentary at some point. But I had originally heard about it on that UFO podcast because the director Kai was interviewed there. But I've been listening to this like crazy. It is so fascinating, and it's interesting the way they speak to evidence and how science and skeptics, dismiss what's right there. It blows my mind. And do you think that we are seeing a sea change where we're putting out evidence and now people are actually taking a look at it rather than just going, oh, that's a great episode for X-Files, or oh, that's great for that sightings, editorial show.
Not in a formal, organized way, but what you're talking about really is the process of disclosure, as opposed to what some of us more naively imagined at first, an event, which it may ultimately be too. All world leaders going on, media at the same time and talking to their people about it, and etc. But can you just restate the question again?
Oh yeah. So the question is, do you see any improvement? Because in this podcast, it's very clear that there's this seemingly double blind, triple blind, undeniably provable, examples of telepathy between these autistic adults, and I think a couple of children, and the UFO phenomena. We have this a plethora of evidence.
I think
is the evidence still being ignored, or are people now actually paying attention to it?
I think people accept, pay attention to, take heart about what they can accept to the very limits. If it pushes too hard, it will create real anxiety, a sense of isolation, challenging all of your beliefs.
Yeah.
It's something that happens every day, but independently. 2 people, 7 people, 4 people, 1 person in different parts of the world have experiences, have sightings, are taken, are returned.
Right.
If they had an interest in the subject, the word belief now is outmoded. Belief has nothing to do with it. It's real. You've had it happen to you. And those people act as anchors within their families, their group of friends, their communities ultimately. And some of them are the ones who go on to give their first talk at a public library or, a church basement, that they connect up with each other. This is a process that now is absolutely unstoppable. But I think those of us in the work sometimes lose sight of the fact that we, in terms of the world population or the Western world, however one wants to break it down, we're still a good way off from a critical mass, which would cause a tipping in terms of social thinking and expression. But things are moving along at a clip, and that can be exacerbated at any given time by another major event, or by possibly, one of the things that derailed the Vietnam War was the unauthorized release of the Pentagon Papers by Daniel Ellsberg, the way that Julian Assange put forward material that got him into so much trouble, but told very uncomfortable truths about this country. Same thing for Chelsea Manning, same thing for a litany of whistleblowers. And now we have this new cadre of whistleblowers, who many of whom are assuming their own place in kind of a demi-celebrity circle that people, unlike us who don't keep track of these things, now know some of these names. And, they've bled out of, bad term. They have expanded beyond, the frontiers of ufology, so to say, to enter the realm of pop culture, popular culture, and the news. And that will continue. I think it's so interesting in a way that it's not like a sporting event, but as though reality cares what we believe or think. That my opinion on this person is, or I think this guy is credible, or this woman, it's like a horse race or something. It's a little like a sport. And for some people, a bit of an entertainment. I think it's also a way to kind of suck the air out of the intensity of some of what they are actually saying, to start to get picky about the personalities, or
Yeah.
we will do anything to evade what makes us uncomfortable enough. And that's a human condition, and that's going to continue.
And there have actually been, and I'm including this in the book that I'm writing, there have been studies that have proven this over and over again. And we're talking about on the political level, like people, highly intelligent, highly educated people in position of power in the science community, uh, in their circles.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It happens when you're in grade school, and it happens as an adult.
Yeah.
The whatever the collective thinks, people are really afraid to go outside of that circle and test the boundaries, because they want to be. There's this desire to be accepted. Peter, your mic went off again.
It's true. And again, it doesn't have nearly as much to do with the world of UFOs as human nature. Also, again, I have to stress that in the old days, there were like worker bees. There were very few stars, one could look to. The fact that at that time, I think Donald Kehoe was still alive, and still doing, interviews. Jacques Vallée was really just beginning his work, and the people did shine. They were important, and their contributions were central. But people came up through the ranks in analog reality. Now, you can become very well known in a moment. I would call it the Oswald phenomena, by attacking somebody super well known, and all of a sudden you're a player. At least folks that are listening to this particular dialogue, and so it goes. It's like professional wrestling on a certain level at its worst, and genuine scholarship at its best.
Yes, I agree on that, but I think we can wrap it up on that point. That's important to have that range. There are a lot of people who just make it big on social media. They post a lot, and essentially they're just a different kind of reporter, right? And I think that's okay. I think that's okay, as long as you understand that that's what you're doing, and you're not pretending to be something else.
Correct.
Yeah, and you do see it on occasion where people will take other people's ideas and present it as their own, and that's a whole another thing. If you could leave us with one thought, what would it be?
Well, it's the simple, basic thought that human hubris, going back to ancient myths, suggests that we are the most extraordinary creation ever to be created or to evolve. And in fact, we don't know that. What we do know, and after all these years, one thing that I can say with absolute certainty is I really have no idea what the big picture is here. I've observed slices that, long enough and carefully enough to make some educated guesses. We're not alone. There are other intelligences that come and go, whether from another dimension, another location in the cosmos. I think the most romantic theory is time travelers from our future. One that I'm very attached to, but have the least feeling of reality around. I'd like to think I'm wrong, because it's an amazing, mind-blowing possibility, but simply that what we really have is a dialogue between human beings and a subject, one of the very few at the moment, that has the potential to bring individuals of entirely different beliefs, sometimes dramatically so, together, and to create more understanding between people. I think next to what is going on with environmental change right now, and political change to a degree, this has to be, the implications of this subject have to be central to all of us more and more as we move forward.
Yeah. So to be an idealist, the UFO subject can bring about world peace.
Wouldn't it be nice?
Who knows? Who knows? Let's pull on that thread and see where it takes us.
I think also we're dealing with a variety of thems, intelligences who are likely as capable and as able to span all of the behaviors of human beings, from extraordinary empathy and kindness to murderous pathology that we don't know. And that I'll close it by reminding us of the wonderful parable about the blind men and the elephant. 6 blind men, one's got the leg, one's got the ear, one's working on the tusk, one's holding the tail, another one the trunk, and they're arguing about what an elephant is. They're all right, but they don't understand that it's all connected. This is connected in some ways, the spiritual, the physical. We're doing our best to wrap our heads around it, but in the process, realizing our humanity, I think, more than anything. And we have quite a ways to go. Boy, oh boy.
We sure do. But Peter, speaking of the best, you are one of the best. Thank you so much again for coming on.
Glad to.
Everyone listening, please check out Peter's podcast. It streams live Monday nights on the UnX network. It is called Meanwhile Here on Earth. Good night, Peter. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. I really appreciate your support. I appreciate your comments and questions in the chat. If you are a fan of this podcast, please subscribe, like, comment down below. And if you listen to the podcast, give a good review and as many stars as possible. That really helps. I super appreciate all of your ongoing support. It's 2025. Hopefully this will be an even better year for UFOs and UAP than the last couple of years, which have been very exciting. So fingers crossed. As a reminder, this podcast is rebroadcast on the UnX network Thursday evenings at 11 p.m. Pacific time, Friday mornings, 2 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Special thanks to Margie Kay and Race Hobbs at the UnX network. Until next time, everyone, peace and love, and I'll see you on the flip side.
It's good to be an earthling. I wish more of us would think of ourselves that way.
I don't have a problem with skeptics. It's debunkers that are on some other level that I don't understand.
Essentially an inference of a change in local gravity.
Saucer-shaped craft. And they're hovering over the water.
Blue Book Special Report 14. The better the quality of the sighting, the more likely to be unexplainable.